The ceiling cracked for the third time in 10 minutes. Ray Castle pressed himself against the wall and counted to 4. The jolt came on the count of 3. A slab fell and shattered where a third echelon fighter had been standing just a second earlier. Dust swallowed him whole. Ray didn't look. He pulled the strap of his load-bearing harness closer and crawled further along the wall. Fault Line 47 was officially considered safe. The association had classified it as Category D 9 months ago. Over those 9 months, 218 raids had passed through it. Not a single one had ended in death. This morning, the Crimson Key Guild had descended with 22 people. Now, 14 remained on their feet. The second level looked different from all the maps. The corridor that was supposed to lead to the warehouse led into a hall. The hall was round and high. The floor was paved with metal slabs. The plates were breathing. Ray could see them rise and fall like a rib cage. In the center of the hall stood a creature that hadn't been mentioned in any report. It was 4 meters tall and consisted of fused metal and bones. The association would later enter it into the registry under the name The Foundry. For now, it had no name. It was merely a mass. It moved slowly, and with every step it took, the slabs hummed. Wade Morrow shouted orders from the upper gallery. Morrow was the raid captain and a C-rank swordsman. He kept the shield bearers in line and demanded that the healer not waste charges on those who were already down. Ray listened and kept crawling. He wasn't a fighter, he was a porter. The association called such people support staff. The guilds called them something else. They were called living cargo. After the rifts appeared, humanity split into 2 unequal parts. Some awakened the combat class, others awakened the service class. The combat class granted power, a place in the guild, and a share of the loot. The service class granted the right to carry others' bags for a fixed rate of 12 credits per descent. Ray had awakened 4 years ago at the age of 19. The system displayed a single line to him. Class, Dungeon Manager. Rank, F. The association's evaluator stared at that line for 8 minutes. Then he wrote No in the applicability column. Then he explained that there were 3 or 4 such classes per 100,000 awakenings and that they were all junk. He explained that the system sometimes made mistakes and that it wasn't Ray's fault. He was almost kind. Ray remembered his kindness very well. In 4 years, the class had given him nothing. No skills, no increase in strength, just one sensation that came inside the fissures and didn't come from outside. The sensation that the walls around him weren't just stone, that they had a blueprint, that the blueprint could be held in his hands. He hadn't told anyone about this. He carried the bags. The foundryman spun around and struck out. The blow hit the wall of shields. 2 held firm. 1 folded in half and flew 10 meters away. Morrow ordered them to retreat to the narrow throat of the corridor. The squad began to back away. And at that moment, the most important thing became clear. The passage behind them had vanished. Where the entrance had been, there was now a smooth slab without a single seam. The hall had closed off. Ray pressed his palm against the slab. It was warm. The people around him began to scream. An association healer named Brogan tried to break through the wall with a hammer, but the hammer bounced off. Morrow continued to give orders, but his voice had changed. He ordered them to split into 2 groups and flank the creature. He ordered the gatherers not to touch the loot. He ordered the porters to come closer. Ray understood the meaning of that last order before the other porters did. There were 4 of them. 4 men without weapons or armor. Morrow came down from the gallery and explained in a calm voice that the creature needed a target. He said it struck whoever was closest. He said that if the 4 of them scattered to the 4 corners of the hall, the creature would lose its focus and the squad would have time to approach from behind. He said this was the standard dispersal procedure and that it was in the regulations. He didn't say how many porters had survived the standard dispersal procedure. 2 refused. Morrow nodded to a collector named Guest. Guest raised his crossbow and aimed it at the back of the nearest refuser. Morrow said that survival protocol was in effect in the enclosed hall and that the captain's decisions were not up for discussion. The porters left. Ray went with them. He didn't argue or beg. He took off his load frame and left it by the wall. He calculated his angle and moved toward it with long strides. He didn't run. The foundry would spot a runner faster. That, too, was in the rules. The creature got the first porter in the 9th second, the second in the 15th. The third ran to his corner and stayed alive for another half-minute. Ray stood in the northeast corner and looked straight at the creature. He saw it turn its head. He saw something white and red-hot rolling around inside its chest cavity. The creature moved toward him. And then a panel unfolded before his eyes. It was unlike the system windows he'd seen on the fighters. The fighters' windows displayed damage numbers and stamina bars. Ray's panel showed a blueprint. It displayed the entire second level of Fault 47 from above. 29 rooms, 6 dead ends, 11 connections. The hall where he was standing was marked in red. Below was a line, Fault 47. Total weight, 4,200. Below that, a second line, Control unavailable. Tag required. Below that, a third line, Emergency edit available. 1 use. Line of sight radius. Ray stared at that third line for 1 second. The creature had crossed half the hall. He tapped the line. The panel opened and revealed what he had felt his whole life but could never name. Weight was not an abstraction. Weight was everything. The walls had weight. The doors had weight. The creature in the center of the hall had a weight of 1,600 out of 4,200. The lighting had weight. Even the air had weight. And most importantly, the panel showed that all this weight could be transferred. It showed this with a single short formula that glowed at the very bottom of the window. The total sum was constant. Ray understood instantly. He couldn't create force. He couldn't destroy force. He could only decide where it lay. The creature was 4 steps away. He pulled. He took 900 units of weight from the foundryman and flung them into 3 empty dead ends at the other end of the level. He chose the dead ends because there were no people there. It took less than a second. The effect was neither instantaneous nor elegant. The foundryman didn't crumble or fall. He simply became thinner. The molten metal on his shoulders began to crack and rained down in large, rusty crumbs. The glowing white in his chest dimmed to orange. His next step was shorter than the previous one. He raised his hand over Ray, and Ray rolled out of the way. His hand slammed into the floor. The floor didn't crack. Half a minute ago, the same blow had carved a crater 2 palms deep into the slab. Now, the slab held. Morrow was the first to notice this because he was watching the fight, not the porter. He bellowed that the creature was running out of steam and that they needed to press the attack. The squad struck all at once. A swordsman named Cullen pierced the armor on its side. Arrows pierced its unprotected neck. Brogan stopped pounding the wall and unloaded the rest of his charge into the creature. The foundryman held out for another 2 minutes. Then he dropped to one knee. Then Morrow drove his blade into its chest cavity and pulled out a white core the size of a fist. The creature collapsed into a heap of metal. The wall at the far end of the hall parted, revealing an exit. People sat down right on the floor. Some were laughing. Others couldn't unclench their fingers from their weapon hilts. Ray lay in his corner, staring at the ceiling. The panel was still hanging before his eyes. It had changed. The emergency edit was marked as used. A new line had appeared below that hadn't been there before. Debt 900. Below that was a second line. Transferred weight not secured with a tag. It will return to the source. Below that was a third line. Return deadline, 6 days. Ray sat up. He stared at the word return and tried to figure out what it meant. It meant that in 6 days, 900 units of weight would leave the 3 empty dead ends and go back. Only there was no source left. The foundry lay in a heap of scrap. The weight had nowhere to return to. Ray didn't know exactly what the system did with weight that had nowhere to go. But he'd seen how this level had closed its door behind it for the sake of a single creature. He could imagine. They left the hall in silence. On the second-level gallery, Selma Irving stopped and looked down. Irving was a C-rank scout and had been hired for the raid from outside the group. She'd worked in the faults for 7 years and knew how to do the math. She told Morrow that the creature weighed no less than a Category B boss, and that in 10 minutes it had lost a third of its mass without a single hit to its body. She asked where the rusty flakes on its shoulders had come from. Morrow replied that creatures inside anomalous zones degrade, and that this was a known effect. Irving said she'd read all 7 of the association's bulletins for this year, and that no such effect was mentioned in them. Morrow said he was the captain and she was just a mercenary. The conversation ended. But Irving didn't head for the exit right away. She stood on the gallery for another half-minute, not looking at the carcass. She was looking toward the northeast corner of the hall. There sat a porter whom the creature hadn't touched, the only one out of the 4. Irving memorized his face. Upstairs, they were met by the association's reception team. Fault Line 47 had been closed for reassessment and upgraded from Category D to Category C. Morrow testified for 40 minutes. According to his account, the raid encountered an unaccounted-for boss, and the captain employed a dispersal strategy that allowed them to exploit a vulnerability. According to his account, casualties among support personnel were unavoidable and within acceptable limits. The inspector recorded everything verbatim. It was important for the inspector to finish the report by the end of his shift. The Foundry Corps was valued at 200,000 credits. The raid's share was distributed according to the standard grid. Combat classes each received 8%. Support staff received a fixed rate. Ray signed the payroll sheet and received 12 credits. The clerk explained that the hazard pay for life-threatening risk is only paid to those listed as combat personnel. He explained this in the same kind voice that the appraiser had used 4 years ago to explain the trash classes. Ray took the 12 credits and stepped out onto the street. Kern Hall was going about its evening routine. An advertisement for the Iron Spire Guild hung above the rooftops. The ad showed a girl in white armor and promised a stipend to all awakened above rank D. Ray walked beneath it and turned toward the transit line. He rode for 40 minutes. The Northern District Medical Center stood on the edge of the residential sector and looked like a concrete beehive. Ward 1140 was on the 11th floor. Mia Castle had been lying there for 14 months. She was 17. She'd been caught in a minor rift rupture on her way home from school and suffered what the doctors called residual tissue contamination. She wasn't in a coma. She simply couldn't stay awake for more than 40 minutes a day. The stasis chamber extended those 40 minutes and contained the spread. The stasis chamber cost 9,000 credits a month. Ray earned an average of 400. For 3 years, the difference had been covered by the association's insurance program for families of rupture victims. Today, a notification was waiting for him on the ward terminal. The program was reducing payments starting on the 1st of next month. The applicant was asked to transfer the patient to the general circuit or cover the difference on his own. The difference amounted to 6,800 credits a month. The first of the month was 11 days away. Ray read the notice 3 times. Then he sat down on a chair by the chamber and stared at his sister through the glass for a long time. He didn't clench his fists or pound the wall. He took out his terminal and opened the association's public rift map. Rift 47 was listed as closed for reassessment. Closed for reassessment meant there wasn't a single raid inside, and there wouldn't be one for at least 4 days. Ray looked at the duration in the panel. 6 days. He did the math. Then he got up and went to get his gear. He bought 3 flashlights, a coil of rope, and a cheap knife that couldn't even kill a rat. That used up all 12 credits and another 40 from his savings. The service entrance to Fault 47 was guarded by 2 association officers on duty. The shift changed at 2 in the morning. Ray knew this because he'd spent 4 years carrying other people's bags and had memorized all the schedules that no one else bothered to remember. At 2 minutes past 2, he went downstairs. It was quiet inside. They hadn't removed the creature. A pile of metal lay in the middle of the hall and gave off a faint smell of burning. Ray walked past it to the far wall and began searching. The panel displayed a diagram, and a single dot was flashing on the diagram. It wasn't on the second level. It was lower down. The panel referred to it as a node, and next to the node was a line that Ray read twice. Control tag installation. Requirement. Physical contact. Warning. Once the marker is set, the fault line is assigned to the operator. Responsibility for the balance passes to the operator. The duty passes to the operator. Ray stared at the word responsibility. Then he looked at the number 900 and at the deadline, which was set to expire in 5 days and 17 hours. Then he climbed down. The descent to the 3rd level took 2 hours. The association's maps ended at the 2nd level. Below that began what the bulletins referred to as the unexplored sector. Ray followed the blueprint that hung before his eyes, and the blueprint was more accurate than any map. The panel showed more than just the rooms. It showed the weight of each one. A corridor weighed 4. An empty gallery weighed 11. A fork in the passage weighed 6. He followed the lightest sections and avoided anything that weighed more than 40. Twice, he stopped and waited. The first time, he waited 11 minutes while something weighing 340 moved along the lower passageway. The panel called it the glass crawler. Ray didn't see it. He saw only the number, and the number slowly shifted across the blueprint from left to right. The second time, he waited 20 minutes. The node was located at a depth of 42 meters. It didn't look like an altar or a heart or anything like what they depicted on popular TV shows about fault lines. It looked like a slab. A round slab, 2 paces in diameter, lay on the floor of a small, empty room. The slab's surface was smooth, with no markings or cracks. The panel illuminated it with white light. Ray knelt down and placed both palms on the stone. The panel expanded to fill his entire field of vision. Fault 47. Total weight 4,200. Current distribution is disrupted. Debt 900. Operator not assigned. Set control marker. Yes or no. Ray stared at it for 30 seconds. He wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking about what was written in small print. Responsibility for the balance passes to the operator. He didn't know what responsibility for the balance meant. He only knew that in 5 days, 900 units would have to return to a source that no longer existed. And that if he left now, it would become someone else's problem, the problem of those who would come down here next. Ray agreed. The plate heated up. Nothing exploded or lit up. A thin line, resembling the mark left by a metal tire, simply ran along his forearms from his wrists to his elbows. It appeared and then faded. The panel reconfigured entirely. Now it displayed a table instead of a diagram. Operator Castle, Fault 47, 3 levels, 74 rooms, 31 creatures. Total weight 4,200. Available balance 0. Debt 900. Time limit 5 days, 14 hours. Below, sections that hadn't been there before opened up. Layout, contents, conditions, rewards. Ray opened the layout section and realized he was holding something in his hands that no one else in this world had ever held. He could rearrange rooms. Not build or destroy them, but specifically rearrange them. The corridor leading from the entrance to the Founder's Hall could be turned around and rerouted through an empty gallery. A dead end could be connected to a staircase. A door could be moved 20 meters. Each operation had a cost in weight, and the cost was small. Moving a wall cost 2. Turning a corridor around cost 5. Connecting 2 rooms cost 12. But his available balance was 0, and Ray couldn't do anything. He opened the population section. There was a list of 31 creatures with their weights and a slider next to each one. The slider moved in both directions. Reducing a creature's weight freed up remaining weight. Increasing it consumed it. He gave it a try. He removed 40 units from the large creature on the 3rd level. The available balance became 40. The slider on the diagram dimmed slightly. Ray restored the weight, and the balance reset to 0. The system operated fairly and was absolutely ruthless. Nothing could be obtained for free. Then he opened the last section, where he found the answer to the question of how to even survive with a class like this. The section was titled Inflow. It contained 3 lines. First, for every hunter who left the fault alive and with a kill, the operator receives an addition to their free balance. Second, for every hunter who died inside the fault, a debt is charged to the operator. Third, when the debt reaches 1/3 of the total weight, destabilization begins. When it reaches half, a breakthrough occurs. Ray sat right on the node's slab and stayed there for 10 minutes. He thought about Fault 47 and its 9 months without a single death. He thought about the 218 raids. He thought about the fact that somewhere in the world there is, or was, another operator who ran this fault before him and ran it well. And that then that operator had disappeared, leaving the rift without an owner. And it had begun to accumulate distortion. And it had raised the foundrymen from no man's weight. Ray couldn't prove it, but he had no other explanations. He looked at the debt figure. 900. 1/3 of 4,200 was 1,400. He wasn't that far off. He had 5 days left, and in those 5 days, he had to send enough living hunters through his rift to pay off the 900. The panel didn't say how much a single hunter was worth. Ray realized he'd have to find that out the hard way. He came up at 6:30 in the morning. Rift 47 was closed for reassessment for another 3 days. 3 out of 5. That was bad. He drove to the medical wing and sat outside room 1140 for an hour and a half. Mia woke up for 26 minutes. She asked why he was covered in dust. Ray replied that he'd been changing filters in the warehouse. She said he was a lousy liar and had always been a lousy liar. She asked about the bills. Ray said the issue was being resolved. She looked at him and said that if he went where he shouldn't, she'd get up and personally drag him out by the collar. Then she fell asleep. Ray sat there for another 20 minutes, staring at her hand under the glass. Then he left and got to work. He spent 3 days preparing, and those 3 days condensed into 4 images for him. The first. He's sitting on the floor of a rented room in the northern sector, tracing the blueprint of Fault 47 onto paper by hand. He isn't drawing what's actually there. He's drawing what will be. He makes the entrance to the fault 2 turns longer and removes all 3 collapses from the immediate area. Second, he's standing in line at the association's archives and pulling up statistics on Category C faults for the past 2 years. Average raid income, average duration, average fatality rate. He jots down the numbers in his notebook, and by the second hour, the clerk asks why a porter needs statistics. Ray replies that he's preparing for the collector's exam. The clerk loses interest. Third, for the third time, he walks through the Freelance Hunters Exchange in the Brass Gate district. The exchange consists of 2 floors of an old arcade and 300 people who haven't been accepted into any guild. He watches, listens, and memorizes faces. Fourth, the night before the opening. He's back downstairs by the node's plate, resting his palms on it for 4 hours straight without a break. He isn't sleeping. He can't afford to sleep. When the association lifted the restriction and opened Fault 47 for 3rd category raids, he was ready. By this point, Fault 47 looked like this. The first level had been completely rebuilt. It used to be a straight tunnel with 2 forks. Now it was a spiral with 7 rooms and a gradual increase in weight from 3 to 18. Not a single creature heavier than 25. Not a single blind turn. The lighting was rearranged so that the hunter always sees the next room before entering it. The reconstruction cost 118 weight units. He took them from 2 crawlers on the 3rd level and from the rubble he cleared away. His available balance was once again 0. His debt stood at 900. The deadline was 2 days and 9 hours. The first raid after the opening arrived at 9 in the morning. It was a 6-person team assembled from the Brass Gate Exchange. Ray watched them from the 3rd level through the panel. He didn't see people. He saw 6 dots on the map and their weight figures, from 30 to 90. An average 4th-rate team. Teams like that usually come back empty-handed or don't come back at all. He guided them through his spiral. He didn't help them, nor could he. All he could do was make sure in advance that they'd have enough. And they did. They cleared the first level in 50 minutes without a single serious injury. They took down 2 small creatures and collected 6 low-quality cores. Then they reached the entrance to the 2nd level and stopped. Ray hadn't touched the 2nd level. He didn't have the weight for it. The team conferred and decided not to take the risk. They headed back. Ray watched as 6 dots crawled toward the exit and counted the seconds. The first dot crossed the fault line. The panel flashed. Free balance, 14. Debt, 886. He exhaled. 6 people had given him 84 units, 14 each for a living hunter with prey. That meant to pay off the 886, he needed to get another 63 people through the fault. In 2 days. At the usual pace for a Category C fault, that was impossible. An hour later, the 2nd raid arrived. Then a 3rd. By the evening of the first day, 4 teams had passed through Fault 47, and all 4 had come out alive. The debt dropped to 794. By the middle of the 2nd day, a rumor was circulating on the Brass Gate Exchange. The rumor was simple. 47 is paying out. Ray heard it himself while standing in line for water in the passageway. 2 collectors were discussing how the layout of Fault 47 had been rearranged after the revaluation, how the first level now ran like clockwork, and how you could earn a 1/3 more per shift there than in the neighboring ones. One of them said that apparently the association had invested in stabilization. The other said that the association had never invested in anything in its life. They both laughed. By the evening of the 2nd day, the line to enter Fault 47 had grown to 40 people. The debt had dropped to 210. And at that moment, a van from the Crimson Key Guild arrived at the fault. Wade Morrow stepped out of the van with 18 fighters. He walked along the line and announced that the guild was taking Fissure 47 for a priority clear lasting 3 days, and that free access was being closed off. He presented the attendant with a document bearing the seal of the regional office. The attendant verified the seal and opened the airlock. The line began to disperse. Ray was 23rd in line. He didn't move from his spot and didn't say a word. He watched as Morrow descended into his fissure. Morrow led the way and moved with great confidence. He was the man who 2 weeks ago had killed a Category B boss and received 8% of 200,000 for it. He was certain he knew this place. Ray's panel showed 18 new points inside the perimeter. The panel displayed the inflow line and the figure for the potential bonus. 18 people meant 252 units. That was more than his remaining debt. Ray could pay it all off in a single raid. He just needed all 18 to come out alive. He turned and walked away from the rift. He walked quickly. He knew one thing that Morrow didn't. The second level was still untouched. The second level had been designed for the old balance, with the foundry at its center, and without the foundry, that balance hung in a void. The 1,600 units of weight that Ray had removed from the creature and scattered throughout the dead-end corridors hadn't gone anywhere. They lay in 3 empty rooms on the second level, and they lay incorrectly. Ray knew what happens to weight that lies incorrectly for too long. He'd seen it in the Northern District Breach Report 14 months ago. He'd seen it in Ward 1140. He ran to the service entrance, climbed down the maintenance shaft, and opened a panel as he went. 3 dead-end corridors on the second level were highlighted in red on the blueprint. The first weighed 340. The second weighed 290. The third weighed 270. And next to each weight value, a line had appeared that hadn't been there that morning. Formation. And hanging over it all was the main line. Debt 210. Deadline 4 hours. Ray stopped halfway down the stairs and realized something simple. The 18 people from Morrow weren't his salvation. They were his schedule. Because if even one of them died in these dead ends, the debt would grow. And if all 18 died, the debt would exceed 1,400, and then destabilization would begin, not just in theory. He hurried back down. The service shaft extended 30 meters downward and ended in a grate. Ray kicked the grate aside and fell into a service niche on the second level. He scraped his shoulder but didn't notice it. The panel swung open while he was still in midair. 18 members of the Crimson Key were moving through the first level. They were moving fast. They were moving too fast. Ray looked at their pace and realized a bitter truth. The spiral he'd built for safety worked both ways. It was convenient. It was easy to run along. Morrow was covering it twice as fast as people would have moved through the old corridor. They had 14 minutes left before reaching the entrance to the second level. Ray opened the blueprint for the second level and looked at the 3 red spots. The first dead end glowed the brightest. The panel displayed a line. Self-generation, stage 2 of 3. Time remaining, 31 minutes. This was the first time Ray had seen this mechanism up close, and it was disgustingly simple. Mass abhorred a vacuum. Mass dumped into a room where it had nothing to cling to began to seek a form for itself. First, it settled on the walls. Then it coalesced into a lump. Then the lump grew a shell and was given a name. The panel had already come up with a name for the first dead end. Surge. Weight, 340. The second dead end was at stage 1 of 3 and weighed 290. The third was lagging even further behind and weighed 270. Ray sat right in the alcove and placed his palms on the floor. The controls only worked when in contact with the fault line. He'd figured that out on the very first night. He opened the filling section and pulled the slider for the third dead end down. There was no resistance. Stage 1 released its weight easily. In 40 seconds, he removed 270 units and the dead end went dark. The available balance became 270. He moved on to the second one. Stage 1 of 3 on the second one was already past the halfway point, and the slider was tighter. He withdrew 290 in 2 minutes.
The available balance became 560. He tried the first one, and the panel failed. The line lit up red. A creature in stage 2 can be lightened by no more than 1/3. Complete removal will lead to uncontrolled disintegration. Ray didn't argue with the system. He removed 110 from the surge and stopped. Free balance, 670. Surge weight, 230. Stage 2 of 3. 24 minutes remaining. Now he had 670 units of weight in his hands, and he had to put them somewhere. Putting them back into the creatures meant bringing the problem back. Putting them into empty rooms meant growing new naplivs in a day. That left the third option, and Ray already knew about it from the planning section. The weight could be incorporated into the structure itself, into the stone, into the walls, into the floors. Weight incorporated into the structure was dead weight. It didn't grow, move, or seek a form. It simply held up the vault. Ray opened the blueprint and began building.
He sealed off the passage to the first dead end with a wall 2.5 meters thick. The wall consumed 180 units. He reinforced the floor slabs above this dead end and spent another 90. He sealed off the second and third empty rooms with solid slabs and invested 200 there. The available balance dropped to 200. The surplus remained inside the concrete pocket. The panel displayed it as a separate point with no exits, and immediately displayed a line of text. Isolation does not prevent formation. Upon completion of the third stage, the shell will gain the right to breach the structure. Ray read this twice. The wall wasn't a salvation. The wall was only buying time. 18 points entered the second level. Morrow arranged them in 3 groups and led them down the main corridor. The main corridor ran straight to the foundryman's hall and passed exactly 6 meters from the walled-off pocket along the way. Ray looked at that section and did the only thing he could. He rerouted the corridor. It cost 5 units. The wall at the beginning of the section shifted 4 meters to the left, opening up an old bypass passage that Ray had found on the blueprint the very first night. The passage led to the same hall but took a detour of 200 meters, steering the group 40 meters away from the niche. The shift took 11 seconds. The lead team of the Crimson Key saw a turn ahead that didn't match the one on the tablet. Selma Irving was walking third and was the first to stop. She compared the tablet with what she saw and told Morrow that the corridor didn't match the association's map in either direction or length. Morrow replied that the map had been drawn up before the reassessment and that the structure always shifts after a reassessment. Irving said that the structure shifts by meters, not by 200. Morrow replied that she had been hired to conduct reconnaissance, not to argue with the captain. Irving fell silent, but she entered a marker and the time into her tablet. Ray saw that mark as a small flash on his panel. He didn't know what it meant. He'd find out later. The team set off down the tunnel. Ray tracked their positions while keeping an eye on the surge timer. 19 minutes. He calculated the route. A detour of 200 meters would take them about 6 minutes. The return trip after the chamber would take another 20. It didn't add up. The swarm would finish forming by the time they were inside. Ray began to think quickly and coldly. He could leave everything as it was and hope the creature wouldn't break through the dome in the wrong direction. He could try to strip away another third of it and cause an uncontrolled collapse in a closed pocket. He didn't know what the decay would do. He opened the conditions section and found what he was looking for there. The conditions section didn't control the creatures or the walls. It controlled the rules: lighting, air density, stone conductivity, shell regeneration speed. Each setting cost weight, and each applied to the entire level at once. Ray found the line: formation speed, a 30% reduction. Cost, 120. He paid. His available balance dropped to 80. The surge timer flickered and updated from 19 minutes to 26. 7 minutes for 120 units. Expensive. He bought another reduction for 120, and his balance went into the red. The panel wouldn't let him. The line lit up red. Available balance cannot be negative. Debt is not a source. Ray took his hand off the wall and looked into the darkness of the service niche. He had 80 units and 26 minutes. 18 people were heading toward the foundry hall along his own route. He made his way eastward along the niche. The niches were part of the old structure and weren't listed in any report. Ray knew about them because he'd seen them on the blueprint, and because not a single hunter had ever looked inside during all 218 raids. He moved parallel to the passageway, keeping his palm against the wall so as not to lose his bearings. The Crimson Key reached the hall in 9 minutes. The hall was empty. The foundryman's carcass had been removed on the day of the reevaluation. Morrow ordered a sweep of the hall and instructed the teams to fan out and check the side passages. He explained that the guild had been granted priority for 3 days, and that during those 3 days they would extract everything they could from the 47th. He said that after the 47th, the Crimson Key would apply for promotion to the Second League. The people were working. Ray lay in a niche 30 meters away from them, watching the timer. 12 minutes. He opened the floor plan and began preparing for what was about to happen. He couldn't stop the creature's birth, so he could choose where it would happen and where it would go. He spent 40 units and moved 2 walls in the far sector. He turned 4 empty rooms into one long passage and connected it to a narrow bridge from the Napliv pocket. The bridge was a weak spot. The creature broke through the vault where it was thinner. He made sure the thinner part was on the side opposite the people. He had 40 units left. The timer reached 0. The vault's ceiling cracked. Napliv emerged into the passage, and the panel displayed him in full. The 230-unit creature didn't look like a foundry worker. It looked like a pile of wet clay that had learned to stand. It had no eyes. It had 6 appendages, weight, and hunger. It moved across the bag away from the hall. Ray exhaled. And at that moment, Morrow sent a reconnaissance team into the far sector. Selma Irving and 2 fighters entered the bag from the east side. Ray saw 3 dots aligned with the creature and realized he'd miscalculated by exactly 1 of the captain's commands. Everything that followed happened in 90 seconds. Irving spotted the swarm first and gave the signal to retreat. One of the fighters didn't make it in time. A protrusion shattered his shield and slammed him into the wall. The second fighter slashed at the mass, and his blade sank into the clay up to the hilt and got stuck. Irving pulled him back by his belt. Morrow led the remaining 2 squads into the bag in 40 seconds. He wasn't a coward. Ray acknowledged that even now. Morrow stepped in first, struck first, and took the second blow on his shield. But the Surge wasn't a foundryman. The Surge didn't have a core in its chest or a vulnerable neck. It flowed. The severed chunk of clay crept back and regrew. In 2 minutes of combat, the guild hadn't taken a single unit of weight off him. The panel showed a steady 230. Morrow ordered them to fall back to the bridge and hold the throat. The men began to retreat. And then Ray saw something on the blueprint that only he could see. The bridge was narrow. 18 men couldn't get through it quickly. The horde was closing in. And then Morrow did what he always did. He ordered 2 junior-rank fighters to stay behind and hold off the creature at the choke point. He explained that otherwise the entire squad would be wiped out. He was right, mathematically speaking. He was right according to the regulations. Selma Irving said she was taking the wounded man away and that the junior squad would go with her. Morrow said that was direct insubordination in a restricted zone. Irving said the zone wasn't restricted. Ray heard the argument through the wall and paid 12 units. A second exit opened in the opposite wall of the bag. A rock simply split apart and slid down the floor in a gentle slope. Irving saw it half a second later. She didn't ask where it had come from. She herded everyone she could reach by voice toward it. 18 people exited the pocket within 40 seconds through both exits at once. The swell remained inside and went after them but couldn't catch up. Morrow led the squad to the stairs and ordered a retreat to the first level. He ordered that the report note the zone contained an unregistered anomalous creature of at least Class C. Ray had 28 units left. He spent 26 and sealed off the swarm again. Now the creature had taken shape and wasn't growing. It was a stable mass inside a sealed bag. It was bad, but it was tolerable. The Crimson Key made it back up to the surface at midnight. 18 went in, 18 came out. 2 on stretchers, and both alive. Ray's panel flashed 18 times in a row, a few seconds apart. The free balance shot up in spurts, 30, 44, 58. The debt was melting away before his eyes. When the last dot crossed the contour, the panel completely reset. Debt 0. Fault 47 is stable, free balance 44. Below, a line appeared that had never been there before. The rewards section is accessible. And even further down, a second line. Fault 47 enters the contour. Nearest node, 12.4 kilometers. The operator isn't responding. Ray stared at the word contour for a very long time. Then he climbed up through the service shaft and walked home across the entire northern sector because he didn't have enough credits for transportation. He walked for 2 hours, thinking the whole way not about the reward or the money. He thought about the fact that somewhere 12 kilometers from here lay another node and that its operator wasn't responding. In the morning, the association sent the 47th survey team. Osmond Kreit from the Anomalies Bureau arrived in person. Kreit was nearly 60 and had been mapping fault lines for 20 years. He was considered a man who was hard to surprise. He descended to the second level with 2 technicians and a laser rangefinder and spent 4 hours there. Then he came back up, sat down on a crate by the entrance, and remained silent for 8 minutes. A technician asked if everything was all right. Kreit replied that the internal volume of the second level was 9% larger than the external perimeter. The technician said the rangefinder might have malfunctioned. Kreit replied that there were 3 rangefinders and that all 3 had given the same reading. He said that over the past 20 years, he had seen walls shift by 2 meters, by 4 meters, and once by 11 meters. He said he had never seen a 200-meter-long corridor that hadn't been on the scan taken 3 weeks earlier. Then he ordered 6 permanent geometry monitoring intentions to be installed in Fault 47, 2 on the first level and 4 on the second. He said that if the structure shifted again, he would know about it the very same minute. Meanwhile, Morrow was giving an interview. He told the Kern Hall network that the Crimson Key had detected a second anomalous form in Fault 47 and contained it without any casualties. He showed footage of the battle. The footage went viral within a day. By evening, the whole city was talking about the 47th, a Category C rift that had spawned 2 unaccounted-for creatures in a month without killing a single person, looked like a gold mine. Kester Vale watched the footage in his office on the top floor of the Iron Spire Tower. He wasn't looking at the creature. He was looking at the exit numbers. 18 went in, 18 came out. He rewound the recording to the moment where a smooth, gentle slope went up on its own in the solid wall of the pocket. He paused the frame. He stared at that frame for 4 minutes. Then he summoned his secretary and ordered her to submit an application to the association's regional office for an exclusive license for Fault 47. He said he wasn't interested in the price. Meanwhile, Ray was standing outside Chamber 1140, reading a notification on the terminal stating that the deadline for paying the balance had been reduced from 11 days to 9 due to a change in the building's funding schedule. The notification remained on the terminal screen, and Ray read it 4 times before taking his hand away. 9 days, 6,800 credits. He had 34 in his account. He looked at his sister through the glass. Mia was asleep, her hand resting on top of the blanket just as it had yesterday, the day before, and 14 months ago. Ray turned around and drove back to the northern sector. He went down to the 47th at 4 in the morning through the service shaft and sat by the hub's control panel until dawn. The rewards section turned out to be different from what he'd expected. He'd thought he'd be able to create artifacts. He couldn't. He could only assign them. The panel displayed a list of what the rift was capable of generating given a certain total weight, and next to each item was a price. Low-quality core, 3. Medium-quality core, 14. Conductivity crystal, 40. Stable Class C core, 95. And at the bottom of the list was a line that Ray read very carefully. The issued reward leaves the circuit. Its weight is permanently deducted from the total weight. Replenishment is only possible through inflow. He did the math. A medium-quality core costs between 900 and 1,200 credits on the market. It cost him 14 units of weight. One live hunter yielded 14 units. In other words, one hunter paid for exactly one medium-quality core and not a single unit more. The scheme worked. The scheme was as thin as paper, but it worked. The main problem remained. Ray was a service-class porter and had no right to either collect the spoils or sell them. Anything he brought up himself would go straight into the records of the guilds that had hired him. He needed outside help. He found it at the Brass Gate Exchange. Dira Folk led a team of 4 and owed the pawnshop 900 credits. Her team consisted of her brother Tolvin, and 2 mercenaries who left her every time a better offer came along. Dira was a D rank. She'd been venturing into the rifts for 9 years and hadn't risen any higher. Ray chose her because he'd been watching the exchange for 3 days, and because she was the only one he'd seen who had never once abandoned her team. He didn't approach her. He sent her a message from an anonymous terminal. The message contained no threats and no promises. It contained a route. 7 turns on the first level of the 47th, precise to the step, a time of 22 minutes, and instructions on exactly where the medium-quality core was located, and a single line stating that half the amount was to be left in locker 118 at the Brass Gate station. Dira read it and deleted it. 2 hours later, she restored the message from the trash and read it again. She told her brother that it was either a trap set by the guild or a joke. Tolvin asked how much it would cost to check it out. Dira replied that entry to the 47th cost 8 credits per person. They went. What followed were 4 images, and each one cost Ray a sleepless night. The first one. Dira is standing at the 7th turn on the first level, looking at a niche in the wall where a medium-quality core lies. She stands there for 40 seconds and doesn't take it. She walks around the niche, checks the floor and ceiling, and looks for a tripwire but doesn't find one. Tolvin says that if this is a trap, it's the laziest trap in history. She takes the core. On her way out, the timer on her tablet reads 22 minutes and 11 seconds. She stares at those numbers longer than she does at the core. Second, Brassgate Station. Durir deposits 470 credits into locker 118 and stands nearby for 40 minutes, waiting for whoever is supposed to come. No one shows up. She returns 6 hours later, and the locker is empty. Third, 8 days later, Duria is now leading a group of 6 people and follows a route that arrives at the terminal an hour before the descent and changes every time. The mercenaries have stopped leaving her. On the exchange, people have started calling her team lucky,
She doesn't argue. She's stopped taking orders from the guilds. The fourth time, night. Diria sits in the warehouse with a core in her hand and tells her brother that whoever writes her routes knows where the stone is before it even gets there. Tolvin says people like that don't exist. Dirira replies that she's been going down there for 9 years, that she knows what luck looks like, and that this isn't luck. Over these 8 days, Ray has guided 47,109 living hunters through and delivered 21 cores to the surface. Revenue totaled 1,526 units. Expenses for rewards amounted to 214. Maintenance costs totaled 300. He invested the remainder in the walls. 7,400 credits were credited to his account. He deposited 6,800 into the medical wing's cashier's office a day ahead of schedule. The clerk issued a receipt and said the program had been extended for a month. He said this in exactly the same tone of voice. Ray took the receipt and, for the first time in 4 years, bought himself a hot meal at a restaurant instead of from a vending machine. He ate it and felt nothing. He thought about the sensors. Osmond Kreit's 6 sensors hung on his blueprint like 6 white dots, each with a weight of 2. He didn't touch them. He memorized their sectors and rerouted all his paths so that no movement of the wall would fall within their range. Kreit was getting a straight line. Kreit didn't believe in a straight line. He came to 47th twice a week and each time personally measured the same corridor with a rangefinder.
On his 4th visit, his assistant asked why he was measuring something that didn't change. Kreit replied that 9% of the volume hadn't gone anywhere, and that just because the structure had stopped moving didn't mean it was dead. He said it meant it had detected the sensors. The assistant laughed. Kreit did not laugh. He wrote that phrase in a memo and sent it to headquarters. The memo was filed away and sat there for 11 days. Then it was read. On the 9th day, the association published the results of the closed auction. An exclusive 2-year license for Fault 47 was awarded to the Iron Spire Guild. The amount was not disclosed. According to exchange rumors, it totaled 2,800,000 credits and was 3 times higher than the starting bid. Public access was closed off at noon the following day. Dira folk found out about this while standing in line at the entrance. The attendant simply stopped accepting tokens. She turned around and saw 3 vans bearing the emblem of the White Tower pulling up to the gates. Tolvin asked what would happen now. Dira didn't answer. Ray found out about it from the news ticker at the station. He was standing by locker 118 with an empty bag, reading the headline and realizing that in a day he would lose access to his only source of income. And that was the least of his problems. The bigger one began on the very first day. Ironspire entered the 47th differently than Crimson Key had. Vale wasn't rushing a mop-up operation. Vale had set up a training ground in the rift. The guild had sent 42 people down, and 30 of them were cadets under 20 years old, ranked E and D. The instructors put them through their paces on the first level in 6-hour shifts. The plan was obvious, and Ray understood it immediately. Level 47 had become a place where they could safely train the rookies, a fissure that hadn't killed anyone in 9 months. Ray sat at the control console, watching the panel, and saw the intake numbers rising like never before. 42 people a day. 588 units. He was rich for the first time in his life, but he couldn't rejoice because he saw the second digit. The instructors led the cadets to the second level. On the 3rd day, a cadet named Halgo went off alone into a side branch and didn't return. Ray's panel flashed red. Debt 40. On the 5th day, 2 cadets broke through that very passageway in the far sector that Ray had sealed off with 26 units. The swarm escaped. He killed one of them before the instructor could make it down. Debt 80. Ray checked everything he could on the panel and found nothing. The Terms and Conditions section allowed him to reduce formation speed and adjust lighting and air density. It did not allow him to block passageways in front of people. The rule was clear. Altering the layout in a sector where sentient beings were present was prohibited. He could only build where no one was present. But the Iron Spire kept people down there around the clock in shifts, without a single break. On the 8th day of his license, Ray tried to descend through the service shaft and discovered a new welded frame and 2 motion sensors on the grate. Vale had sealed off the service entrances within the first day. Ray was left outside his own fault line. Control required contact with the rock inside the perimeter. The panel, without contact, displayed only a summary. Debt 120. Debt 160. Debt 210. He stared at those numbers from the street through the chain-link fence and couldn't do anything. He returned to his place at 4 in the morning, and Selma Irving was sitting outside his door. She was sitting on the top step of the flight of stairs, holding a tablet on her lap. Ray stopped on the landing 1 floor below. Irving didn't stand up or reach for her weapon. She said she'd been waiting 3 hours and that if she'd wanted to turn it in, she would have done so 9 days ago. Ray asked who she was supposed to turn it into and for what. Irving turned the tablet so the screen faced him. On the screen was a diagram of the 2nd level of Building 47, with a timestamp and 2 lines. One line was the association's map. The second was her own track. Between them lay a 200-meter corridor. She said she had 4 such markers. She said the first one was made on the day the Foundryman was destroyed, when the creature lost 1/3 of its mass in 10 minutes without a single hit to its hull. She said that in both raids, there was one person who was in a place where, according to all the lists, they shouldn't have been. The porter from the northeast corner. Ray remained silent. Irving said she didn't know how he did it and that she wasn't interested. She was interested in something else. She said there was an exit in the bag that wasn't supposed to be there, and that she'd led 6 people out through it, 2 of whom were her former students. She said she'd been going down there for 20 years and didn't like being in anyone's debt. Ray asked what she wanted. Irving replied that she wanted to work. She said that a C rank and 7 years of intelligence work were worth more than what the guilds paid her for the right to die on the orders of a man like Morrow. She said that he needed hands on the ground and eyes on the ground, and that he knew that better than she did. She added that someday he'd tell her the truth, and that she knew how to wait. They sat on the steps and talked until morning. Ray didn't tell her about the class or the panel. He told her about the debt. He explained that in 47, a process was underway that would kill everyone inside if it wasn't stopped, and that the process had a counter that increased every time a person died there. He said that the Iron Spire had raised him from 0 to 210 in 8 days. He said that at 1,400, what the association calls destabilization would begin. Irving listened without interrupting. Then she said that 14 months ago, there had been a destabilization in the Northern District that the association had called a spontaneous rupture of a minor fault, and that she had been there on the 3rd day and had seen the street. Ray said that his sister had also been on that street. Irving looked at him and asked no further questions. In the morning, they got to work. The first thing Irving did was apply for a position at Iron Spire as a freelance reconnaissance instructor. She was hired within 2 hours. The guild was short on people with real-world experience, especially with 30 cadets to train. The second thing she did was carry a piece of rock downstairs. Ray explained to her that he needed contact with the fault line rock and that he couldn't go inside. Irving suggested bringing the piece outside. Ray checked the panel, and the display showed a failure. Rock outside the perimeter loses connection. Then Irving suggested the opposite. She said that if he couldn't get inside through the entrance, he should try from below. She unfolded a diagram of the northern sector's drainage system in front of him. Kern Hall stood on old industrial strata, and an abandoned spillway ran beneath the 47th. Irving said that if the fault had widened by the 9% the Anomaly Bureau was making such a fuss about, then it had widened downward as well. Ray looked at his third-level blueprint and at the depth of 42 meters and realized she was right. That night, he descended into the spillway, walked 1.5 kilometers along it, and found a spot where the concrete of the conduit had been breached from the inside, and beyond the breach lay the fault rock. He placed his palm on the rock, and the panel unfolded completely. Debt, 240. Available balance, 3,120. 8 days of 42 cadets per day earned him a fortune in weight, and he couldn't spend it on layout because people didn't leave the levels for even an hour. He spent it differently. He invested 900 units in the conditions section and reduced the spawn rate across the entire fault by 70%. He invested 600 in stone conductivity, which gave the cadets 15% more time between creature spawns. He invested 400 in lighting all the passages on the second level. He couldn't block a passage in front of a person. He could make it so that a person would see a creature 4 seconds earlier. Over the next 6 days, no one died in Sector 47. The debt stood at 240. The instructors at Ironspire attributed this to their own training methods. Kester Vale received the report and ordered the intake to be increased from 42 to 60. It was then that Ray took a serious look at the line about the perimeter for the first time. The nearest node was 12.4 kilometers away. The operator was not responding. Irving pulled up archived footage of the district and found what she was looking for in half a day. 12 kilometers southeast of the 47th was the flooded neighborhood of Lower Pier. The neighborhood had been submerged 9 years ago following a ground collapse and had been closed to civilians. No faults were listed there. The association had never recorded anything in Lower Pier. The two of them went there together on the night of the 7th day. The water came up to their waists and smelled of iron. They found an entrance under an overturned overpass, and it didn't look like a fault. It looked like a crevice. Inside, it was dry and very quiet, and Ray's panel immediately displayed a different report. Fault not registered, 2 levels, 31 rooms, 0 creatures. Total weight 5,000. Debt 3,100. Irving asked why there were 0 creatures. Ray replied that he didn't know and that this was the worst thing he'd ever seen. The creatures were a form into which the weight was packed. 0 creatures with a weight of 5,000 meant that 5,000 units were lying in that place without any form. They traversed both levels in an hour and encountered nothing alive. The walls were covered with salt-like growths. In places, the floor buckled beneath their feet like thin ice. The node lay on the lower level in a room with a collapsed ceiling, and next to the node lay a man. He had been there for a long time. All that remained of him were his jacket, his bones, and his association service badge. Ray placed his palm on the slab, and the panel displayed a line of text. Operator T. Halden. Status, dead. Term, 14 months. Tag, not transmitted. Ray sat down on the floor next to the bones and couldn't bring himself to think for a long time. Irving picked up the badge, read the number, and said that this man had been listed as a junior surveyor in the Anomalies Bureau and that he had gone missing the year before last. Ray told her that 14 months ago there had been a breach in the Northern District. Irving said she remembered. Ray said that the Northern District was 4 kilometers away as the crow flies, and that if this fault had discharged excess energy 14 months ago, it had discharged it right there. Irving didn't say anything. She stood there looking at the bones of the man who had held that knot and died, and after his death, there was nowhere left to put the weight. Ray realized 3 things at that moment, one after another. First, the breach that took 14 months of Mia's life didn't happen because the fault was malevolent. It happened because the operator had died and no one had taken his place. Second, He himself had been doing exactly the same thing in 47, and he was the only reason people hadn't died back then. Third, there could be more places like this in the city, and no one in the world knew about them except him. He placed both palms on the panel and accepted the mark. The pain came immediately. The wire-like lines on his forearms swelled and burned, and this time they didn't fade. The panel displayed a report, and the report was a verdict. Operator Castle, Nodes 2, Fracture 47, total weight 4,200, debt 240, unnumbered fracture, lower pier, total weight 5,000, debt 3,100, destabilization threshold 1,666, breakthrough threshold 2,500. Current status: destabilization has been active for 14 months. Irving asked what he saw. Ray replied that he saw a place that had been falling apart for 2 years now, and that it hadn't completely collapsed only because no one was there. A new line appeared below the summary, and it was the first piece of good news in a long time. The circuit is established. Weight transfer between nodes is available. Distance, 12.4 kilometers. Throughput, 20 units per hour. Ray did the math. 3,100 units of debt at 20 units per hour equals 6.5 days of continuous pumping. The 47th's available balance stood at 1,220 after all investments. That wasn't nearly enough. But the principle worked. The 47th fed 60 cadets per day, 840 units a day. He could pay off someone else's debt by pumping for someone else. For the first time ever, Ray smiled as he stood in the darkness over the bones of a man he'd never seen. He initiated the transfer, and in that very second, the panel flashed and reconfigured, and both smiles vanished from his face at once. Line 1, Fault 47, Debt 240, Debt 290, Debt 380. Line 2, Exceedance of permissible headcount recorded, 61 sentient beings in the circuit. Kester Vale sent 61 people down to Fault 47 simultaneously that night. And the third line, which Ray read 3 times and couldn't believe, not the first time, nor the third. External request to overwrite the marker. Fault line 47. Source unidentified. Operator unknown. 71 hours until overwrite is complete. Ray made it out of the spillway in 11 minutes and kept counting in his head all the way to the car. Lower Pier's debt was rising at a rate of 40 units per death. The threshold for a breach stood at 2,500 and had been crossed 14 months ago. The place hadn't blown up only because there was no one inside and the blast had nowhere to go. Now there was a target. Irving drove through the northern sector on a red light and said nothing. She asked only one thing. How many were there? Ray replied, 9. The water in the flooded block was higher than last time. They entered under an overturned overpass, chest deep in water, and climbed out into a dry crevice, where Ray lay down on a rock right in the passageway. The panel swung open and revealed exactly what he'd been afraid to see. 9 dots on the lower level. 3 of them were already motionless. Debt, 2,860. He ran down, and Irving overtook him on the very first descent. Lower Pier greeted them with silence and the smell of iron. The salt deposits on the walls had grown thicker than they had been 9 days ago. The floor of the gallery buckled beneath their footsteps like sheet metal. They found the first person 20 meters from the descent. He was sitting with his back to the wall. He was alive, but unresponsive. Irving shone her light in his face and recoiled. A growth ran down his left shoulder and neck. It was white and porous and resembled the same salt that covered the walls. It had grown into his coveralls and skin and continued to grow as they watched. Ray understood the mechanism immediately, and this realization made him feel colder than the water. The weight was seeking a form. In 47, it found its own form and sculpted the swell and the foundry workers out of nothing, because there was material to work with. Here, 5,000 units had been lying in dead stone for 14 months and couldn't get their act together. And then 9 warm, moving bodies entered, carrying a finished blueprint. The weight didn't attack people. Weight used them as a foundation. Irving asked if it could be removed. Ray placed his palm on the stone, opened the contents, and found the growth in the list. Form, incomplete. Weight, 90. Host, sentient. He slid the slider down, the panel gave way, and the growth crumbled into gray dust. The man collapsed onto his side and began breathing rapidly and shallowly. Ray transferred 90 units to his available balance and looked at the debt figure. It hadn't changed. He understood that, too. The weight removed from the person returned to the common pool and remained formless. He was removing a symptom. After that, they worked quickly. Irving went first, locating the people, while Ray cleaned them with his hands on the stone. The second, the third, the fourth. The fifth turned out to be a woman in her 50s. The growth covered half her face, and she was unconscious but alive. The sixth was lying right at the entrance to the node room and had been dead for about 20 minutes. The panel displayed a weight of 34 and a message, host unsuitable, procedure terminated. Ray took those 34 units and felt nothing except that his count had gone down by 1. They found the last 3 in the node room. 2 were lying down. The third was kneeling over the slab, both palms pressed against it, his hands covered in growths almost up to his elbows. He was young, maybe 25. He kept his hands on the stone and didn't move them even when Irving grabbed him by the shoulder. Ray looked at the panel and saw a line next to that dot. Operator. Markers 0. Overwrite progress 4%. The kid had been sent to set the marker. The registry had sent an operator without a single node and 8 escorts inside, and they were going to set the marker in a place where a 14-month-old had been waiting specifically for a human form. Ray forcibly pried his hands off the slab. The growth cracked and crumbled. The guy looked at him blankly and said he'd been told to hold it for 40 minutes per hour and that he was holding it. He said this twice, using the exact same words. Irving carried him out on her shoulder. Ray remained alone at the slab, placed his palms on it, and looked at the report. Fault without a number. Total weight, 5,000. Debt, 2,900. Shells, 0. And below that, the panel displayed for the first time a line he had never seen before in any section. Free weight cannot remain formless. In the absence of a shell, formation continues using available hosts. He sat at the stove and thought for exactly 20 seconds. It was pointless to extract people. As long as there was someone alive inside, the weight would mold a growth out of them. And as soon as no one remained inside, the weight would start accumulating again and, sooner or later, find its way out, just as it had 14 months ago in the Northern District. The problem had no solution in the form in which he had framed it. That meant he had to change the form. Ray opened the filling section and found a subsection there that he had never touched until that night. It was called shell creation. The panel listed the requirements plainly. Free weight required. An anchor required. An anchor can be a physical object located within the contour that has no weight of its own in the system. The shell inherits the anchor's contour. He looked at the floor next to the slab. There lay bones and a jacket, and there also lay the Anomalies Bureau's service badge on a broken chain. Halden, junior surveyor, the man who held this spot and died, and after whose death the street in the Northern District ceased to exist. Ray picked up the badge, wiped it on his sleeve,
and placed it on the node slab. The panel responded instantly. Anchor accepted. Available free weight 2,900. Set the shell parameters. He then worked for 18 minutes, and they were the strangest 18 minutes of his life. He wasn't creating a monster. He selected each parameter so that the result could do no harm. Mobility, minimum. Aggression, 0. Perception, contact only. Regeneration, disabled.
Every parameter he removed returned weight back to the common pool, and Ray fed it back again and again into the only field he was boosting: mass. He poured everything he had into mass. He wasn't building a predator. He was building a container. The panel calculated the total and issued a card. Shell formed. Designation: none. Weight: 2440. Threat class: D. Anchor carrier: T. Halden. And following that, the line for which it was all done. Det 460. The floor in the room rippled. 3 steps away from the slab, something Ray had just assembled with his own hands rose from the stone. It was twice a human's height and had neither a face nor limbs in the usual sense. It was a pillar of dense white substance resembling caked salt, and it stood motionless, radiating a steady warmth. The token hung within its mass at chest level and was transparent. Ray stared at it for quite a while. Then he said aloud that he would call it the Watcher. He said this in the empty room and didn't even understand why. Upstairs, Irving was waiting for him with 8 people, 7 of whom were alive. She carried them out to the ramp one by one over the course of 2 hours, and by the end of the second hour, her hands were shaking. She scraped the salt growths off those Ray hadn't had time to clean himself with a knife. The panel recorded each exit. The count dropped by 14 each time. 460. 446. 432. By dawn, he was at 362. Merrick Lan arrived at Lower Pier at 6 in the morning. He came alone and waded into the water wearing an expensive coat, which he didn't take off. He saw his men on the concrete slab under the overpass and counted them twice. Then he crouched down next to the boy whom Ray had pulled away from the slab and stared at his hands for a long time. He asked Ray what had happened here. Ray replied that the registry had sent an unmarked operator to a place where the weight had been unable to find a form for 14 months, and that the weight had found it in his men. Lan said that was impossible because formation only occurs through shells. Ray replied that there hadn't been a single shell here, and that Lan could have checked that before sending living beings here. Lan fell silent. He remained silent for a very long time. He was a man who had led 4 nodes for 9 years, and who, 20 minutes ago, had been certain he knew everything about the rifts. Ray watched as the certainty faded from Lan's face, and felt no sense of triumph. Then Lan asked how much the debt was now. Ray replied, 362. Lan asked again. Ray repeated it. Lan stood up and went downstairs by himself. He returned 40 minutes later, looking ashen. He said he'd seen what was in the node room. He said that in 9 years, he'd never once heard of an operator creating a shell from scratch, and that the registry considered it impossible because none of the 17 had ever been able to find the anchor. Ray said the anchor had been lying on the floor for 14 months, and that all he'd had to do was pick it up. Lan asked whose token it was. Ray replied that it belonged to Halden. Lan turned away and stood there for about a minute. Then he said he was withdrawing his claim to the 47th. He said he would write off 61% today with no strings attached. He said he owed Ray 7 lives and that the registry pays the bills. Ray replied that he wasn't asking for anything. Lan said that was too bad. He pulled out a terminal and sent the file. He said it was a circuit map, 41 nodes per country, with coordinates, operator names, and current debts. He said this was the first time in 11 years he'd shown this to someone outside the registry, and that he was doing it not out of gratitude, but because Ray had learned more about their work in a single night than they had in a decade. He said it was now up to Ray to decide what to do with it. Then he gathered his men and left. Irving asked what was in the file. Ray opened it in the car and they looked at it together. 41 nodes, 34 under operators, 7 unclaimed. 3 of the 7 within a 20-kilometer radius of Kern Hall. And below the map, a line showing the total debt along the perimeter, 19,400. Ray closed the terminal, leaned back in his seat, and stared at the car's ceiling. He thought about the fact that he had 2 tags and 1 container he'd cobbled together from a dead surveyor's token. He thought about how that wouldn't be enough. At 8 in the morning, his terminal received 2 messages in a row. The first was from Daira. The association had approved the reclassification of Fault 47 to Category B. The loading limit of 80 people per shift would take effect at noon. The second was shorter. The reception desk at the Iron Spire Guild reported that Mr. Kester Vale was expecting Mr. Castle today at 2 o'clock and that a car would be waiting at the Brass Gate Passage. The car was pulled up to the entrance at 5 minutes to 5. Ray got in wearing the same jacket he'd had on the night he'd been crawling through the flooded neighborhood, and the driver didn't say a word. The Iron Spire Tower stood in the central district and was visible from anywhere in Kern Hall. The elevator took 50 seconds to reach the 41st floor. Kester Vale greeted him in an office with a glass wall and made no pretense of being busy. He stood up from behind his desk and waited for Ray to sit down. He was about 50 years old and possessed that kind of calm that comes from having a great deal of money. He began immediately, without preamble. He said that over the past 3 weeks, he had read everything there was to read about Ray as a member of the service class. He listed the details. Awakening 4 years ago. Class without application. 218 descents as a porter. The northeast corner of the hall on the day of the foundryman's death, where 1 of 4 survived. A bag on the second level where a smooth slope opened up in a solid wall. Registration with the Miner Guild as a route analyst. An expert report from the Anomaly Bureau signed personally by Osmond Kreit. He said he didn't know how it worked and that he didn't need to know. He needed results. Then he named the figures. 400,000 credits as a signing bonus. 8,000 a month as a salary. The transfer of patient Castle from the general ward to the private Hayfield Clinic with full stasis coverage for the next 3 years. The position of structural consultant, reporting directly to him personally. The only condition? Exclusivity. Ray was silent for about 10 seconds. Then he asked about the 80 people. Vale replied calmly that the quota had been approved and that it would take effect at noon. Ray said that the 47th wouldn't be able to handle 80. Vale asked on what basis. Ray replied that the second-level structure was designed to accommodate 8 people at a time, and that with 30 people inside, a vault had already collapsed, killing a cadet, and that with 80, more than one vault would collapse. Vale said that the collapse had been documented and investigated, and that rock fatigue had been identified as the cause, and that the Anomalies Bureau had found no connection to the load. Ray said that the Anomalies Bureau had sent memos 3 times and had them returned 3 times. Vale replied that memos without numbers were just literature. Then he did what he always did when the conversation reached an impasse. He explained his position honestly, and that only made things worse. He said that the license cost $2,800,000, that it was valid for 2 years, and that this meant 24 months to recoup the cost. He said that the 47th was the only fault line in the region where not a single person had died in 11 months before the arrival of the Iron Spire, and that this made it an ideal testing ground, and that the testing ground only paid for itself through volume. He said that the 200 cadets in the fall intake weren't a matter of greed, but of math, and that if he didn't run them through the 47th, he'd run them through the 41st, where the mortality rate is 3 times higher. He said he saves more lives than he takes, and that he's ready to defend this arithmetic anywhere. Ray listened and realized that the man sitting across from him wasn't a villain, and that this was far worse. He asked what would happen if he refused. Vale replied that nothing would happen. He said that no one would take away the Key and Stone Guild's quota of 6 people because it had been signed off on by a bureau expert. He said that Ray could continue to go down there with his shift and do whatever he wanted within the limits of the charter. Then he added one sentence, delivering it in an even tone without any emphasis. He said that the Northern District Medical Center is funded through the Relief Fund for Breach Victims, that the Iron Spire is one of the 3 founders of this fund, and that the decision to cut the program last month was made by the fund's board. He said he wasn't drawing any connections between these things and was simply providing information. Ray stood up. He said he'd think it over, then left and stared at the wall in the elevator for 50 seconds. A car was waiting for him downstairs, but he declined and walked instead. He walked through the Central District for an hour and a half, and during that time he made a decision that he would not change until the very end. He couldn't outbid Vale. He couldn't out-argue him. He couldn't stop 80 people, and he couldn't stop 200. So he had to make sure that the 47th was no longer the only one. By evening, he had gathered everyone in his room on the first floor of the passageway. Dira, Tolvin, Irving, the 2 mercenaries who had stopped trying to leave. He unfolded a contour map in front of them. He didn't say a word about the markers or the panel. He said he knew the coordinates of 3 locations within a 20-kilometer radius of the city where there were faults that weren't listed in any of the association's registries. He said that if the small guild announced the discovery of a new fault, then, according to the charter, it would receive the right of initial development for 90 days without any license and without any auction. Dira stared at the map for a long time. Then she asked where the coordinates came from. Ray replied that he wouldn't say. She asked if there were people there they could send in as decoys. Ray replied that there weren't. She said that was enough. Next came 4 images, and they completed the task in 6 days. The first, the industrial zone beyond the Eastern Ring Road. Tolvin and one of the mercenaries spent 3 nights in a row clearing a collapsed service tunnel beneath the old warehouse. On the 4th night, the tunnel leads to a crack in the rock. Ray places his palm on the stone, and the panel displays a summary. The fault is not registered. 1 level. Total weight, 1,800. Debt, 90. Operator, absent. He makes a mark, and the lines on his forearms burn for the 3rd time. He already knows it will pass in 4 hours. Second, application to the regional office. Dira stands at the counter and hands in the opening form. The clerk looks at her as if she's crazy, but accepts it anyway. A day later, the commission arrives, confirms the fault, and assigns it number 208 and category E. The Key and Stone Guild is granted 90 days for initial development. Third, the first descent into 208. 6 people. Ray had previously reconfigured the single level into a spiral of 9 rooms with increasing difficulty from 2 to 14. The shift lasts 4 hours. All 6 make it out. The panel flashes 6 times. Fourth, the brass gate exchange in 4 days. 40 people are lined up at the Key and Stone counter, and Dira is taking applications on a first-come, first-served basis. Level 208 pays less than level 47. Level 208 doesn't kill. Over the past 6 days, 312 people have passed through level 208, and no one has died. The guild earned 11,000 credits in net profit. Ray transferred 2 months' worth of fees to the medical wing's cashier and received a receipt, and the clerk told him the same thing in the same voice, and for the first time in 4 years, Ray didn't react at all. Over those 6 days, he had reduced Lower Pier's debt from 362 to 40 because the circuit was finally working both ways. The 208 turned out to be small and poor, but clean, and its revenue went entirely toward the transfer. The guard stood motionless in the node room, and the panel showed a stable reading of 2,440 and a threat class of D. Ray went down there every third night to check on him, and each time he lingered by the control panel longer than necessary. On the 7th day, Merrick Land kept his promise. The rewriting progress on the 47th unit was reset to 0. Land sent a single 4-word message stating that the account was closed and wrote no more. And on the 8th day, Wade Morrow returned to Kern Hall. The Crimson Key was disbanded at the end of the month after the guild failed to qualify for the second league. Ironspire hired Morrow as a senior combat training instructor at Facility 47 with a salary that the Crimson Key had never paid him. On his very first day, he lined up the cadets at the gate and announced that the standards would be tightened and that the cushy conditions were over. Irving saw him at the facility, and that same evening told Ray that things were going to get rough down there. She was right. In the 4 days under Morrow at Site 47, 3 people died. The casualty count went up, and Ray sat in the spillway at night, resting his hands on the stone and trying to keep the numbers down as 80 people arrived per shift. But he couldn't keep up. 90, 160, 240. He stopped handing out awards altogether. He took everything he could from the 2 crawlers and the surge and invested it in the second-level ribs. The available balance hovered around 200 and wasn't growing. And on the 12th day after the meeting with Vale, Osmond Crate arrived at the Brass Gate Passage at midnight. He went up to the second floor and placed a printout on the table in front of Ray. It showed the readings from 6 geometry sensors over the past 3 days. 5 lines were perfectly flat. The 6th had 4 steps on the graph. Crate said that he had removed the 6th sensor from the second level and recalibrated it himself 3 days ago without telling anyone. He said he now had the numbers. He asked Ray if he wanted to explain anything before these numbers went to the commission. Ray looked at the graph and saw his own hands on it. 4 steps. 4 nights. He opened his mouth to reply, and at that moment, his panel flashed red for the first time in 12 days. Fault 47. Critical stress detected in load-bearing structures. Second level. Sector 4. Estimated time to failure, 40 minutes. 79 sentient beings inside the perimeter. Ray stood up so abruptly that his chair flew back against the wall. Crete didn't have time to ask anything. Ray told him just one sentence, and that sentence cost him everything he'd been hiding for 4 years. He said that in 40 minutes, Sector 4 on Level 2 of the 47th would collapse, and that there were currently 79 people there. Crete asked how he knew that. Ray replied that he knew it from the same source as the 4 steps on the graph. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, and Crete followed him. Irving had the machine up and running in 2 minutes. De'Ira had the entire shift on standby. On the way, Ray was calculating. The spillway provided contact with the rock but didn't generate speed. From there, he could only feed weight into the structure, and there was nothing left to feed. The available balance for that hour was 210. According to the panel's calculations, Sector 4 required at least 900 to support the load of 80 people. There was nowhere to get those 900 except from the fault itself. And there was a second way. the key and stone quota. 6 people per shift with the right to perform geometric inspections. He could have entered the 47th legally through the main gates, stayed inside, and kept his hand on the rock for as long as he wanted, and no one had the right to stop him. He had never taken advantage of this because he would have been seen inside. Today, that no longer mattered. They pulled up to the gates at 1:50 a.m. The guard on duty accepted the guild tokens and let the 6 of them through. Ray, Irving, De'ira, Tolvin, 2 mercenaries. Crete went through 7th, using his Anomalies Bureau ID, and the guard logged him as a separate entry. The night shift was underway below. 80 people spread across 3 levels, and Morrow was running 2 squads through the old corridor at full speed. Ray went down to the 2nd level, lay face down on the floor in a service niche, and opened a panel, while Irving stood over him and kept everyone else at bay. The first thing he did was check Sector 4. The sector was a long passageway between the old tunnel and the Foundry Hall. All 3 teams passed through it several times during the night. The panel showed a load of 340% of the design capacity, and 3 load-bearing ribs, 2 of which had already developed micro-cracks. 38 minutes. Ray began reducing the load wherever there were no people. He removed 180 from the 2 crawlers on the 3rd level, reducing their load to nearly 0. He removed 140 from the far walls of the 1st level. He removed 90 from the ceilings in 6 empty rooms. He removed 60 from the lighting throughout the fault, and on the 3 levels of the 47th, the passageways dimmed and someone upstairs screamed. He gathered 680 and poured them into the 1st rib. The panel recalculated. Load, 290%. 26 minutes. It wasn't enough. Next, he did something he'd never dared to do before. He entered the filling section and opened the Naplava card. The creature, weighing 230, had been sealed in a bag in the far sector for a month. The panel displayed the same message as the first time. A Stage 3 creature can be lightened by no more than 1/3. Complete extraction will lead to uncontrolled disintegration. Ray looked at the distance from the bag to the nearest people. 40 meters and 2 walls. He chose disintegration. He extracted everything from Naplava. 230 units were drained in 11 seconds, and in the far sector of the 2nd level, something heavy crashed down, sending a wave of dust across the entire level. The panel noted the event matter-of-factly. Shell destroyed. Uncontrolled disintegration. Local structural damage in Sector 7. Ray poured 230 into the 2nd rib. Load, 240%. 19 minutes. He lay on the floor, his fingers trembling, and he realized he had drained the fissure dry. Free residue? 0. The total weight of 4,200 hadn't gone anywhere, but now it was all either in the walls, in the people, or in the tiny bits left on the crawlers. There was nothing left to take. And then he remembered something he had never once considered a resource. 208. The circuit. 20 units per hour. He opened the transfer unit and reversed its direction, realizing that 20 per hour was nothing when you had 19 minutes left. He started it anyway. Then he did the only thing left to do. He looked up and told Irving that the people had to be evacuated from Sector 4 immediately, or else the dome would collapse there in 18 minutes. Irving didn't ask how he knew. She went upstairs to see Morrow. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, and Ray could hear it through the alcove. Irving said that the 2nd level was about to collapse and that the shift had to be evacuated. Morrow asked on what grounds. Irving replied that it was based on the geometric monitoring being conducted by the Key and Stone Guild under their quota. Morrow said that the quota gave them the right to measure, not to command the shift. Irving said that in that case, he should give the order himself. Morrow replied that he wouldn't let the knight's quota slip because of a former mercenary's word. At that moment, Osmond Crite joined the conversation. He didn't argue. He presented Morrow with his Anomalies Bureau Expert ID and an article on geometric monitoring, and declared the facility temporarily closed for an urgent inspection effective immediately. He said he would take responsibility for the decision and that he would sign the order himself. Morrow turned pale and said that Vale would destroy him for this. Crite replied that it was quite likely. An evacuation was ordered within a minute. 80 people began to leave, and it turned out to be slower than Ray had anticipated. The group was spread out across 3 levels, and some of the cadets were in distant branches, so he had to rely not on the team, but on how fast the slowest person could run. He lay on the floor, watching the dots crawl toward the exit, keeping the panel open and doing the only thing he could still do. He drew energy from the floor beneath the departing cadets' feet and channeled it into the vault above their heads. He drew 40 from the first-level floor and channeled it into the vault. He drew 30 from the partitions and channeled it into the vault. He stripped his own body down to the bone for the sake of 20 minutes. The last 7 people were passing through Sector 4 when the timer showed 2 minutes. Morrow was second to last. He was herding 3 cadets ahead of him, shoving them in the back, and Ray saw this on the blueprint as 4 dots moving in a tight group. Ray himself was last because Irving had grabbed him by the collar, lifted him off the floor, and shoved him into the passageway. The vault of Sector 4 collapsed 40 seconds after the last person had exited. The collapse wasn't loud. It was long. It lasted 8 seconds, and the dust billowed into the main corridor all the way to the stairs. Upstairs, Crete counted the evacuees twice. 80. That's it. Ray's panel flashed 80 times in a row, and the influx came in a wave unlike anything he'd ever seen. He stared at the numbers and couldn't focus his gaze. Debt, 240. 200. 120. 0. Available balance, 890. Rift 47 is stable. He sat right down on the ground by the gate and stayed that way for about 5 minutes. Dira brought him some water. Irving stood nearby, saying nothing. Crete stood 3 paces away, staring at him intently, and Ray realized that this man had just seen everything there was to see. He had seen the service class porter lie down on the floor 40 minutes before the collapse that no one knew about. At 4 in the morning, Kester Vale arrived at the site. He listened to Crete. He listened to Morrow. He demanded access to the lower levels, but Crete refused and presented an order. Then Vale approached Ray. He looked at him for quite a while and didn't say a single word of the kind people usually say in such situations. He said only that the offer still stood and that it was now worth twice as much. Ray replied that it didn't. Vale nodded and drove away. By noon, the Anomalies Bureau had sealed Fault 47 for a full 14-day investigation. The Key and Stone Guild received an official contract for geometric monitoring of the site. Morrow was suspended pending an investigation. Osmond Crete received a notice from headquarters regarding a disciplinary review of his conduct. He read it and told Ray that it had been worth it, that Ray now owed him an explanation, and that he was willing to wait until the end of the investigation, but no longer. And at 1:15 in the afternoon, Ray's panel displayed the line he had been waiting for and dreading for all those 6 hours. Unnumbered fault. Lower pier. Contour weight extraction. Total weight 4,820. Guardian shell. Stability compromised. Threat class recalculated. DCB. He had drawn 180 units from the harbor to keep the dome over the 80 cadets. He had taken them from whatever was holding the Watcher in place. Ray read the line about Threat Class B and got up from the ground at Gate 47 before he finished his water. Dira asked where he was going.
He replied that he was heading to Lower Pier and would be back by evening. Irving went with him without asking any questions. Crate stayed at the gate with his orders and his official inspection, watching them leave, and Ray knew that this man wouldn't be going anywhere now. The water in the flooded neighborhood had risen another palm's width over the past day. They entered the underpass at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Ray lay down on a rock in the very first dry crevice. The panel unfolded and displayed what he already knew and what he didn't know. Fault without a number. Total weight 4,820. Debt 0. Guardian shell. Weight 2,260. Threat class B. Mobility restored. Perception. Contact. Regeneration active. He looked at the last 3 lines and understood what had happened. He had assembled the Guardian as a container, forced everything that was there into the mass, and reset every parameter that made the shell dangerous to 0. He didn't think at the time that the parameters didn't actually disappear. They simply remained at 0 as long as there was enough mass to keep them there. He withdrew 180 units from that mass for the arch above the cadets. The system recalculated the balance and returned some of the parameters to their natural state. Not because it was malicious, because that's how mass worked. It was always seeking form, and form always strove to live. Ray opened the shell's data card and tried to reset mobility to 0. The panel calculated the cost. 340 units required. The available balance at the harbor node was 42. He opened the circuit and initiated a transfer from node 47, where 890 units remained after the evacuation. 20 units per hour. 17 hours. He looked at the number and headed downstairs to check for himself. The guard wasn't standing where Ray had left him. He was standing 20 meters from the node room in the lower level gallery, leaning against the wall with the part of himself that now looked more like a limb than a salt outcrop. Halden's token hung in his flesh in its usual place. He didn't move when they entered. He turned his entire mass toward them only when Ray took his 3rd step, and this movement sent a low rumble rippling through the gallery. Irving raised her weapon, and Ray stopped her with his hand. He stood 6 paces away, watching, and the Guardian stood there, making no move to approach. His perception was tactile. He could not see them. He could only sense what he touched and hear the vibration of the stone beneath their feet. Ray realized this and took 2 more steps, and the Guardian lurched forward and stopped again. Ray stepped back. They exited the gallery with their backs to it. Upstairs, Irving asked why he hadn't killed it while it was motionless. Ray replied that killing the shell meant returning 2,500 units to formless mass, and that within a day after that, the harbor would begin to form growths on every living thing inside. He said that the Guardian wasn't a creature. It was a lid on a cauldron. He said that the lid had grown heavier and that now it could walk. Irving asked what would happen if it went outside. Ray replied that he didn't know, that he had a hunch, and that he didn't like that hunch. He returned to the spillway by nightfall and spent 17 hours driving the mass along the perimeter. At the end of the 17th hour, he allocated 340 to mobility and reset it to 0. The guard froze in the middle of the gallery where he was standing. The threat level dropped to C. Ray looked at the number and realized he couldn't lower it any further to D because that would require another 600 units, which none of his 3 nodes had. He jotted this down in his notebook on a separate line. A debt that cannot be repaid right now. He summoned Kreda himself. On the 3rd day of the examination, he called him into a room on the 1st floor of the brass gate passageway and told Dare and Irving to stay behind. He spoke for 40 minutes and said everything. He talked about the awakening and about the class that the appraiser had deemed worthless. He talked about the panel and about total weight, and about how weight cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. He explained the inflow. A living hunter with 14 units of prey. A fallen one owes 40.
He explained the thresholds. 1/3 of the weight causes destabilization. Half causes a breakthrough. He talked about the foundryman and the first emergency edit, about the mark on the node, about how he restructured the first level into a spiral, about the surge, about the sensors he memorized and spent a month navigating around. He told him about the lower pier and the bones of the surveyor from the Anomalies Bureau, and about what happened in the Northern District 14 months ago, and why. He talked about the registry, about Node 41, and about the guardian he'd fashioned from a dead man's token. Crate listened without interrupting once. When Ray finished, he sat in silence for about 3 minutes. Then he said that he'd been mapping fault lines for 20 years and all that time hadn't understood one thing. He said he hadn't understood why some faults age peacefully while others go haywire, and why this didn't correlate in any way with category, depth, or rock composition. He said that now he understood, and that this realization made him want to go outside and stand in the fresh air. He went out and stood in the courtyard for 20 minutes. Then he returned and asked his first question. He asked about Halden. He asked if this man had been on the Bureau's payroll the year before last, and Ray replied that he had and gave his badge number. Crate pulled out his terminal, checked it, and said he remembered him. Young, quiet. He'd applied for a transfer to the field team, been turned down, and resigned of his own accord a month later. Crate said he'd signed that rejection personally. He said it without emotion, and Ray realized that now this man would have his own entry in his notebook. From then on, they worked together. Crate brought everything he'd accumulated over 20 years from the Bureau, and they sat down to go through it. 4 diagrams in 5 days. The first, a table in the passageway room is piled high with printouts. Crate is sorting the cases by volume discrepancy. Out of the district's 290 faults, a discrepancy was recorded in 31. Ray cross-checks the 31 numbers against Land's map. 26 match the nodes of the circuit. 5 don't match anything. Second, Crate plots the trends for the 5 mismatches and discovers that all 5 have been creeping upward in internal volume over the last 2 years, uniformly and without a host. He says these are strays that the registry doesn't know about. Third, Ray calculates the total debt. 41 registry nodes add up to 19,400. The 5 unknowns, by his estimate, amount to between 4,000 and 6,000. That comes to a total of about 25,000 units of debt in the district, with a combined weight of all nodes at about 180,000. He looks at the ratio and says that the circuit is closer to the general destabilization threshold than it seems. Fourth, Crate asks what will happen if not just one node, but a cluster of linked nodes fails. Ray remains silent and does not answer because he does not know. The panel has never shown him that scenario. On the 6th day of the investigation, the 47th Anomaly Bureau issued a preliminary conclusion. The collapse of Sector 4 was deemed to be the result of exceeding the permissible anthropogenic load. It was recommended that the standard of 80 people for Category B faults be revised. The report was signed by Osmond Crate. 2 days later, the Central Department rejected it. The wording was polite. The recommendation was not supported by comparable statistics from other Category B sites. Crate read it and said that this was the signature of a man he'd known for 22 years. He named the man, Dorian Hest, Deputy Chief of the Association's Central Department, the very same man who had returned his memos 3 times. Ray jotted down the name and that evening forwarded it to Lan in a single line, without explanation. Lan replied 6 hours later, and his response was brief. He wrote that Dorian Hest was listed in the registry under number 3, and another day later, people arrived at Lower Pier. There were 12 of them, and they weren't from the registry. They came with tunneling equipment, a generator, and weapons, and began working at the far end of the upper level. Ray's panel showed them as 12 dots with a line next to them. Exterior work, rock removal. He watched this while lying on a rock in the spillway 12 kilometers away and couldn't understand why anyone would want to break through the walls in an unregistered fault. Not until he looked at the entire blueprint and saw the vector. They weren't going deeper. They were going sideways. They were breaking through the rock toward the adjacent sector where, according to Lana's map, the unmonitored node number 9 lay 3 kilometers away. Someone had decided to connect the two faults manually. Withdrawing 180 units restored the Sentinel's mobility and regeneration and raising it to Class B. Ray spent 17 hours pushing the weight along the 47-unit contour and reduced mobility to 0 at 340 units, lowering the threat level to C. But returning to D would require another 600 units, which aren't available. Ray opened up completely to Osman Crate and told him about the weight class, the thresholds, the markers, the registry, and the Guardians, while Crate admitted that he personally signed Halden's transfer denial. Together, they cross-referenced the Bureau's archives with the map of Lana. 26 nodes matched. 5 rifts turned out to be unknown to the registry and unclaimed, while the total debt for the district was about 25,000, with a total weight of 180,000. The Central Department rejected Crate's report with a signature from Dorian Hest, who, according to Land's response, is listed in the registry under number 3. In the end, 12 unknown individuals with tunneling equipment began breaking through the rock at Lower Pier toward the unregistered node 3 kilometers away. Ray understood the purpose of the tunneling by the second hour of observation. The circuit connected nodes across a distance and allowed 20 units of weight to be transferred per hour. Physical contact with the rock eliminated the distance. 2 faults fused by their walls became one, and the weight between them equalized instantly. He checked this on the panel, and the panel confirmed it with a dry line in the planning section. Direct connection of circuits. Bandwidth is unlimited. Physical contact with the rock is required. Warning: debts are cumulative. Thresholds are recalculated based on the combined weight. He sat down and did the math. Lower Pier weighed 4,820 with a debt of 0 and was holding the watch at 2,260. Orphaned node number 9 on the Lana map weighed about 3,000 with a debt of about 2,200 and had been in a state of destabilization for 2 years. Upon connection, the total weight became 7,820 and the total debt 2,200. The destabilization threshold for the combined fault rose to 2,606. In other words, the merger pulled the dying node out of the red zone in a single move. It was genius, and it was suicide. Because, within the combined circuit, the Watcher gained access to all the available weight at once. Lon arrived 4 hours after the call. He looked haggard and hadn't slept, and the first thing he said was that the registry had split. He explained briefly. 11 out of 17 operators are demanding that node stitching begin immediately because the circuit's total debt has been growing for the 3rd year in a row, and the collective transfer can no longer sustain it. 6 are against it. He said the argument of the 11 was simple, and that there was no way to refute it. A stitched-together circuit is one huge fault with enormous weight and very high thresholds, and one can live with that balance for decades. He said the argument of the 6 was also simple. No one has ever stitched together faults, and no one knows what will emerge within the combined weight. Ray asked who was leading the 11. Lon replied that it was Dorian Hest. He said that Hest had been in the association's central department for 11 years, and that for all those 11 years, he had been raising the load standards and rejecting everything that came from below, and that now it was clear why. The influx. The more people inside,
the faster the debt is paid off. Hest wasn't a madman. Hest maintained the country's outline through the flow of people and did so in the only way he knew how. Ray said that this method had killed a cadet in Sector 4. Lan replied that he knew, and that Hest knew too, and that Hest considered it an acceptable price to pay.
6 days passed, and they were condensed into 4 images. First, the passageway room. Lan unfolds the boundary map on the table, and next to him, Crete places the Anomalies Bureau map, and for the first time, they see the complete diagram. 41 registry nodes, 5 unknowns, 3 ray nodes, 49 points across the country and the lines connecting them. Lan says that in 11 years, no one has ever pieced this together. Second, the industrial zone beyond the Eastern Ring Road. 208. De'ira leads a 6-person shift and brings the entire group through, then another and another. The Key and Stone Guild moves 400 people through 208 in a week, and the entire parish heads along the perimeter to the harbor. Tolvin asks why they aren't taking the cores. De'ira replies that they just aren't, and that's that. Third, night. Ray lies on a rock in the spillway for 8 hours straight, pushing his weight, and Irving sits next to him, holding his shoulder when he stops responding. He raised the pier to a free balance of 610 and lowered the watch to Class D, spending everything the 3 nodes earned that week to do so. Fourth, an office on the 41st floor. Kester Vale reads the Bureau's report rejecting the recommendation and signs the order to resume operations on the 47th floor at full capacity, with a fall intake of 200 cadets. He signs it, then sits and stares at Dorian Hest's signature beneath the rejection for a very long time. On the 7th day, Ray went to see Vale on his own. He didn't request a meeting. He drove to the tower, identified himself to security, and was escorted upstairs 40 minutes later. Vale received him standing up. Ray placed 3 items on the table: a copy of the outline map with no names, Crate's report, and the calculation for the 47th, based on 200 people. He said he wouldn't ask for anything and wouldn't sell anything. He said he'd come to explain everything once and then leave. He explained everything in 20 minutes. He explained the weight, the thresholds, and the inflow, and explained why a fault that doesn't kill isn't a gift of nature, but someone's handiwork. He said that for 4 years he'd carried other people's bags in the 47th, and that all 218 safe raids before his arrival were the work of a man whose bones now lie in the flooded district. He said that 200 cadets aren't a testing ground. It's a way to pay off debt faster than it's being written off. Vale listened while standing and didn't interrupt. Then he asked 2 questions. First, how many people in the country can do what Ray can do? Ray replied that there were about 20. Second, which of them is on the association's board? Ray replied that it was the deputy chief of the Central Division. Vale sat down. He sat in silence for about 2 minutes. Then he said that he now understood why, in 11 years, not a single attempt by the guilds to lobby for a reduction in the standards had made it to the commission. He said that Ironspire had submitted such paperwork 3 times and been rejected 3 times, and that the signature had always been the same. He said he'd lost people over this. Ray asked what he was going to do. Vale replied that he didn't know, and that this was the first time in many years that he didn't know. He didn't rescind the order, nor did he sign a new one. He merely said that the fall recruitment drive had been postponed by 2 weeks for technical reasons. Ray left the tower and realized that was all he was going to get, and that it wasn't enough. On the 9th day, the tunneling in Lower Pier reached its target. Ray sensed it while lying on a rock in the spillway at 2:45 in the morning. The entire panel flickered all at once. Direct connection established. Unnumbered fault. Lower Pier. Unnumbered fault. Node 9. Total weight 7,960. Debt 2,240. Destabilization threshold 2,653. Guardian shell. Available free weight 4,100. Threat class recalculated. DCBA. Ray jumped up and hit his head on the concrete of the collector, then fell back onto the rock and clung to it. The Guardian was taking weight. It was taking it on its own, and the panel didn't ask for permission because the shell, within its own boundary, was entitled to free weight under the same rules that applied to Napliv in the walled-off pocket. Ray tried to remove mass from him, and the panel refused. Class A shell. Removal limited to no more than 1/3. He removed 1/3. 1,360 units went into the reserve, and the guard dropped to Class B. 11 minutes later, he retrieved them from the common pool and returned to Class A. Ray withdrew again and lost another 12 minutes. He realized he was losing the race he himself had created. Irving asked what to do. Ray replied that they needed to seal off the passage those 12 people had broken through and disconnect the circuits. He opened the floor plan, and the panel displayed the cost. A plug with the same cross-section as the passage. 2,200 units required. The available balance after the withdrawal was 1,360. He sent everything he had in circuits 47 and 208 through the circuit. 890 and 320, 20 units per hour. He calculated the time and came up with 3 days, then realized he didn't have 3 days. And then he opened the map of LAN and looked at it no longer as a threat map. He looked at it as a resource. 49 nodes, 180,000 units of weight, 25,000 in debt, and one Class A shell that had just demonstrated its ability to absorb free mass without limits and without question. He stared at it for about 5 minutes and then said aloud into the empty spillway that he was an idiot. He had been building a container. He built it. He'd simply built it before he realized what it was actually for. Irving asked what he'd come up with. Ray replied that he'd figured out where to put the 25,000 units of debt scattered across the country. He said that to do this, he wouldn't need to stitch together just 2 nodes, he'd need to stitch them all together. Ray laid out his plan in the passageway in 11 minutes, and no one interrupted him. He said that the 25,000 units of debt in the district and across the country were a weight that lay formless, and that a formless weight always finds a bearer. He said that the registry had been dampening it for 11 years with a human flow, and that the flow was a reprieve, not a solution. He said there was only one solution: to gather all the free and shapeless weight of the circuit into a single shell with an anchor and keep it there. Lan said that a Class A shell was already uncontrollable. Ray replied that the shell is uncontrollable because it takes on weight on its own. He said that if you drive weight into it consciously and to the limit, and then sever it from the contour, it will become what he intended it to be: a lid. Lan asked what sever meant. Ray replied that it meant removing the anchor. He explained the mechanics. The shell inherits the anchor's contour. The anchor is Halden's token lying within the watch's mass. As long as the token is inside the watch's contour, it is part of the system and is entitled to its mass. If the token is physically removed beyond the fault line, the shell loses its connection and turns into a closed mass with no inflow and no regeneration. Lan asked what would happen to the mass itself. Ray replied that it would remain stationary. He said that 25,000 units would be removed from the country's balance sheet and become a single immobile pillar of salt beneath the flooded neighborhood, and that this pillar would not grow, would not seek a host, and would not kill anyone. He said that this was not a victory, it was a storage facility. Irving asked who would go to retrieve the token from inside the Class A shell. Ray didn't answer, and everyone understood. What followed were 4 days, and they were the most intense of his life. First scene. Lan gathers 6 operators from his side, and they establish contact with the 28 nodes across the country that are still maintaining the balance. Conversations continue over the terminals all night long. By morning, 22 operators agree to contribute their spare capacity to the joint transfer. 6 refuse. Lan doesn't pressure any of them. Second scene. Osmond Kreit submits a 140-page package to the association's commission and demands an emergency hearing on all the district's fault lines. The package is structured so that it cannot be rejected by a single signature because it lists 26 petitioners, with the Iron Spire Guild listed first. Vale signed it. He signed it on the 3rd day after the conversation and did not explain why. Third, the industrial zone and the spillway. Ray works around the clock, sleeping only 3 hours at a time, and Irving shuttles him between 3 locations. The 208th is giving it their all. The 47th is giving it their all. 22 of the country's nodes are transmitting 20 units per hour each through the circuit, and that turns out to be a lot. Over 4 days, 11,400 units arrive at Lower Pier. Fourth, Dira leads the last shift out of the 208th, locks the entrance, and hangs a sign on the gate announcing a temporary closure by order of the guild. Tolvin asks how long it will last. She replies, "Until the end." Dorian Hest intervened on the 3rd day. He didn't come by or call. He simply signed an order at the central office authorizing an unscheduled inspection of the Key and Stone Guild, revoking the Anomalies Bureau's expert conclusion regarding Object 47, and suspending Osmond Kreit from duty until the conclusion of the official investigation. Kreit received the notice at 7 in the morning. He read it, drove to the bureau, turned in his pass, returned to the passage by 9, sat down at his desk, and remarked that he now had plenty of free time. Then Hest took a second step. He dispatched contractors to Lower Pier to continue tunneling toward the 3rd node. Lan found out about this and called Hest personally. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Lan got out of the car after Hest and said he'd spoken with a man who was absolutely certain he was right. He said that Hest didn't consider the watch a threat. Hest considered it a solution. Hest wants to map out the entire country's outline, place a growing shell within it, feed it a steady stream of people, and keep it that way forever. Lan said that Hest called this a controlled equilibrium. Ray asked how many people were needed to maintain such an equilibrium. Lan replied that, according to Hest's calculations, about 60,000 hunters per year. Ray didn't ask how many of them wouldn't make it. The operation began on the night of the 5th day. By this point, the Guardian weighed 14,200 and stood in the lower-level gallery of the pier, with a threat-level panel showing an S. It didn't move because all its mobility was being used to support its mass. It resembled a white column propping up the vault, and a steady, low hum emanated from it that could be heard through the water above. Ray fed everything that came in through the circuit into it. 22 of the country's nodes contributed their remaining power. The 47th and 208th drained themselves to 0. Kreit and Lan uncovered 5 unknown stray nodes within a day, and Ray marked them one after another and stripped all 5. By morning, the wire lines on his forearms hadn't faded at all. The panel displayed a summary that he read as both a verdict and a glimmer of hope. Operator Castle, tags 9. Total circuit weight, 178,400. Circuit debt, 900. Free circuit weight, 300. Guardian shell, weight, 24,600. He had gathered almost everything into it. Across the country, the rifts stood empty as if drained, and the association recorded this as an abnormal drop in activity, unable to understand the causes. One last thing remained. Ray went down to Lower Pier at 2:30 in the morning. Irving and Lan went with him, while Crete stayed upstairs by the overpass with the terminal. Deira was covering the exit. Morrow arrived an hour before they went down, and no one had called for him. He stood by the water in an old jacket without any insignia and told Irving that he'd been suspended 2 weeks ago, that he'd read the Bureau's report in its entirety, and that his last name was listed in the section on the evacuation procedure violation. He said he wouldn't explain anything and would simply go down because they needed someone there who knew how to hold the line. Irving looked at him and said he would go last and do as he was told. He agreed. By this time, the lower-level gallery had changed. Salt had built up on the walls to a thickness of a palm's width, and the floor vibrated continuously. The Guardian stood at the end of the gallery, filling it from floor to vault. The token hung within its mass at chest height, 3 meters from the edge of the mass. 3 meters of white substance that was growing back in a matter of seconds. Ray lay down on a rock at the entrance to the gallery, opened the panel, and did what he'd been saving up for over the last 3 days. He removed a third from the Guardian. 8,200 units went into the circuit's free weight, and the mass sank and moved away from the walls, leaving the token a meter from the edge. 11 minutes. Irving went first. She took 8 steps across the vibrating floor. The Guardian swayed, and she stepped aside, but it grazed the wall, sending salt cascading from the ceiling. Morrow grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her back. Lan made the second attempt, and he was thrown back 4 meters. He broke 2 ribs, but remained conscious. 6 minutes remained. Ray stood up from the stone. He removed his hand from the rock, and the panel went dark. For the first time in many weeks, he was without it. Irving said he wouldn't make it. Ray replied that he would make it because the shell's perception was tactile and it could sense the rock's vibration, and that he was the only one here who weighed 31 and had been walking silently for 4 years straight with other people's bags on his back. He took off his jacket and boots and set off. He took 22 steps across the vibrating floor, timing each step to coincide with the rising hum. The guard didn't turn around. Ray approached the very edge of the mass and saw a token in the white substance at the depth of a palm, and behind it, darkness in which there was nothing. He reached out, and the substance burned his skin. He grabbed the chain and yanked. The guard swayed with his entire mass. Morrow got there first. He entered the tunnel in 4 strides and shoved Ray in the back. Ray flew forward and to the side and rolled across the salt, while Morrow took the brunt of what was coming down from above. The tunnel ceiling collapsed 20 meters away. It took 40 minutes to pull them out. Morrow was the last to be pulled out. He was alive, though his right leg was broken and his shoulder was shattered. He cursed once when they laid him on the concrete beneath the overpass and said nothing more. Ray carried Halden's token in his fist. He waded knee-deep through the water with it to the edge of the fault line and took one last step out, and the panel flashed before his eyes one last time that night. Anchor moved outside the perimeter. Guardian shell disconnected. Weight 24,600. Inflow unavailable. Regeneration disabled. Mobility disabled. Threat class D. Circuit debt 900. Free circuit weight 8,200. He sat down right in the water, unclenched his fist, and looked at the junior surveyor's badge from the Anomalies Bureau hanging on a broken chain. Above, over the flooded neighborhood, dawn was breaking. It took a long time for dawn to break over Nizhnaya Pristan. Ray sat in the water for about 10 minutes until Irving lifted him by the shoulders and led him out onto the concrete. Crite took off his jacket and draped it over Ray. Lan lay nearby, breathing shallowly through his ribs, staring at the sky, and said that in 9 years he'd never once been outside at the moment when the fault line went quiet. He said you could hear it. Ray listened. The rumbling from under the overpass had stopped. Morrow was the first to be taken away. He regained consciousness in the car and asked Irving if everyone had gotten out. She replied that they had. He closed his eyes and asked no more questions. The association's hearing took place 11 days later. Crate had been preparing him for 4 days from his room in the arcade because he didn't have access to the office. The dossier had grown from 140 pages to 300, and it contained everything. The dynamics of internal volumes across 290 faults over 20 years. The correlation between anomalies and emissions. 6 entries from Ray's notebook. The graph from the 6th sensor with 4 stages. The conclusion regarding Sector 4. Data on 27 nodes that, over the past month, had simultaneously and inexplicably lost activity. Ray sat through this hearing for 3 hours without saying a word, because it wasn't his turn to speak. Merrick Land did the talking. He stepped before the commission with broken ribs, gave his name, and said that he had been monitoring 4 faults in this country for 11 years and that there were 17 people like him. He told the whole story in 40 minutes. There were 9 commission members in the room, along with 2 guild representatives, and Kester Vale sat as the third, listening without moving. Dorian Hest sat in the front row and did not stand up even once. When Land finished, Hest asked to speak, was granted the floor, and spoke for 20 minutes, and he spoke well. He said that for all 17 years, he had been in charge of a system that had no laws, no oversight, and no funding, and that during those years, the country had not lost a single city. He said he was prepared to take responsibility for every decision. He said that load limits were the only tool available, and that if the commission found a better one, he would be the first to support it. He made no excuses and told no lies. The commission listened to him in complete silence. Then Crite placed a single page before them. It was a list of those who had died at Facility 47 during the term of the Iron Spire license. 4 names. Opposite each was a date, and next to it was the amount of debt that death had added. Crite said he didn't consider Hest a criminal. He said he considered him a man who, for 11 years, had made decisions about other people's lives on his own and without the authority to do so. He said the question wasn't whether Hest was right or wrong. The question was why one man alone had made those decisions. The commission's decision came 9 days later. It was cautious and half-hearted, and Ray read it in the passageway room, realizing that it was still more than he had ever expected to receive in his entire life. The association recognized the existence of the Dungeon Manager class and established a registry of operators with mandatory registration. Workload standards for all categories were reduced pending a review. Mandatory third-party geometric inspections were introduced. A structural balance department was established under the Anomalies Bureau, complete with a budget and staff. Osmond Crite was appointed head of the department. Dorian Hest was suspended from his position pending the conclusion of the investigation, but retained control of 4 nodes under the department's supervision. Land said that this was the best thing that could have happened and the worst thing that could have happened, and that at his age, they were one and the same. The Iron Spire's fall recruitment class numbered 200 people and did not take place in 47. Vale spread them out across 11 sites, 30 per shift, and filed an application to have his own license reviewed with a view to shortening its term. He called Ray again and repeated the offer for the 3rd time, and Ray refused for the 3rd time. Then Vale asked what he wanted instead. Ray replied that he needed a contract with the Key and Stone Guild for structural oversight of all Iron Spire facilities in the district. Vale laughed for the first time since they'd met and said that would cost more than $400,000. He signed the contract. Mia woke up on the 26th day after Lower Harbor and didn't wake up for just 40 minutes. She woke up for 4 hours and the next day for 6. The doctor said that the residual tissue infection was behaving atypically, that the background radiation in the Northern District had dropped by 19% over the past month, and that he wouldn't venture to draw any conclusions. Ray didn't bother explaining to him that the 24,000 units of formless mass that had hung over this area for a year and a half now stood as an immovable pillar of salt beneath the flooded neighborhood and would neither grow nor move ever again. He just sat by the bed and listened to the nurse speak. She said he looked terrible. She said he'd lied to her about the filters in the warehouse. She asked what he'd gotten himself into. Ray replied that it was a long story and that they had plenty of time now. 2 months later, she was transferred from stasis to a regular ward. 4 months later, she walked out of the building on her own 2 feet and stood on the street, squinting, while Ray held her by the elbow and Irving waited in the car. By winter, the Key and Stone Guild had grown to 19 members. Dira folk repaid 900 credits to the pawn shop by the 3rd month and never took out another loan after that. Tolvin led shifts on the 208. 2 mercenaries stayed on permanently. Selma Irving was listed as a senior scout and spent half her time in the Strategic Balance Department, where Kreit was assembling the country's first field diagnostics team. Wade Morrow was discharged from the clinic 5 months later. He walked with a cane, and his right arm wouldn't raise above his shoulder. He came to the passageway on his own and stood in the doorway, and Dira asked what he wanted. He replied that he knew how to teach people to get out of rifts alive, and that he didn't know how to do anything else. They hired him as an evacuation instructor. Ray spoke with him about 4 times over the entire period, and not once did they mention the Foundry Hall, the 4 stretcher bearers, or the northeast corner. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something else for which Ray had no words. By spring, the registry had ceased to exist in its former form. 12 operators registered voluntarily. 3 left and didn't get in touch. Lan was the first to register. He was assigned number 1 and said it wasn't a reward, but a place in line. He managed his 4 nodes under the supervision of headquarters and came to Kern Hall once a month, where he and Ray would sit over a map and do the calculations. The country's total circuit debt over the winter had fallen from 25,000 to 9. The free weight was increasing. 27 nodes had emerged from destabilization. 3 remained in it, and they were working with them. 5 unclaimed nodes were assigned operators from among the newly awakened, whom the administration had begun searching for nationwide through the same evaluation procedure that, 4 years ago, had marked no in the applicability column. Ray turned in 7 of his tags. He kept 2 for himself. Fault 47 and the unnumbered fault in Lower Pier, which had been assigned number 001 in the administration's registry and designated a closed facility under constant surveillance. He visited Fault 47 once a week to reconfigure the first level to meet the new standards, and for the first time ever, he did so not in secret, but according to a schedule coordinated with the administration. He went down to Nizhnaya Pristan once a month. The tunnel had been sealed off. The lower-level gallery had been cleared. The guard stood in the same spot where he'd stood that night, a white, motionless column measuring 24,600 units. Threat Class D. The inflow was inaccessible. It neither grew, nor moved, nor sought a host. Ray would come, place his palm on the stone, and check the report, and the report never changed. Then he would go back upstairs. He had carried the Anomalies Bureau's service badge on a broken chain in his jacket pocket for nearly a year. In the spring, he handed it over to Kreit at headquarters and asked him to enter T. Halden into the operator registry posthumously under number 0. Kreit did so. In the personnel file under number 0, there was a single line. Operator. Fault line 001. Length of service unknown. Reason for termination of duties: death on site. Ray looked at that line on the terminal and thought about how, 4 years ago, an association evaluator had spent 8 minutes scrutinizing his class and written that it had no practical application and that he was almost good. He thought about how that man hadn't been wrong. The Dungeon Manager class truly granted neither power, nor skills, nor rank. It granted one thing: the right to decide where to place the weight, and nothing more. And that turned out to be enough for one street in the Northern District to be the last. He closed the terminal, left the control room, and walked down the street toward the transit line. It was mid-May, and an advertisement for the Iron Spire, featuring a girl in white armor, hung over Kern Hall. Ray walked beneath it without looking up. Mia was waiting for him at the bus stop with 2 cups of coffee and told him he was 12 minutes late. He replied that he'd been held up at work. She asked what kind of work. He replied that he was moving heavy things from one place to another. She said that was the most honest description of anything she'd ever heard from him. They got on the train and headed home.